live stream tonight. We have a really exciting night planned for tonight. We have on with us a special guest. She's been with us before. Lori Hellis has spent years representing adults and juveniles as a fierce public defender, but she recently retired to follow her dream of writing. She authored the No Nonsense Guide to Divorce, Getting Through and Starting Over, and she is now writing a book on the Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell case. She served 20 years in the Air National Guard. So welcome, Lori.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
We were also going to have with us Jessica Bublitz, and she's not going to be with us tonight because of her court trial schedule. So, but we have so many questions. I could not believe I asked for help coming up with questions. I said, give me some ideas of things you really want to know about. It was unbelievable. There were so many questions. People really have a lot of things they want to know and understand about the case. I want to do one quick answer to Mary Kay Sugarman, who asked about some of the phone calls and text messages and what has been put in and what hasn't. I agree that all of that and putting it in perspective in the timeline is really important. I've done a timeline in the case, and you can head over to my Twitter at Lawyer Lee W to find that timeline so you can get that information. But let's get started with some questions about the case. Now, Lori has actually been attending the trial in the overflow room since it started. With a single day's exception, she has been there the whole time. And she has a great perspective, a lot of information to give us. I want to ask you, Lori, about this. David Warwicks' dream. It seems kind of off, almost suspicious. He has a horrendous nightmare. And I realize I should go ahead and say, I'm jumping right in the middle. I'm assuming that everybody probably knows a little bit about the case, that Lori Vallow Daybell is accused of murdering her son and daughter and of conspiring to murder Tammy Daybell, Chad Daybell's wife. David Warwick had a dream the night the prosecution thinks JJ was killed. So, and that dream just seems kind of off. And we had some good discussion about that in the questions. People really wanted to know more about that. We had it from Missy I. Hunt and Kristen Merrill and Chris Lamberg and Dawn Shackelford. I want to know, Lori, what's your read on that? What's your thought on that?
You know, it's a little bit hard to parse. And I've heard his testimony now twice. Once at the preliminary hearing and once here. He's pretty consistent about it. I think they were a little embarrassed about the fact that they were sleeping in the same bedroom and they weren't married to one another. There's some questions about whether or not they were both divorced at the time. So I think they were a little bit uneasy about that. But what we know is that in the middle of that night, let's back up. That evening, they were recording a podcast. They were at the Center Island in Lori's apartment. And Lori said JJ had been acting up on and off all day. And so she had her brother Alex come and get JJ and take him to Alex's apartment. And so later on that evening, they're still working on the podcast. David Warwicks says he had his back to the door, but he hears the door open. And then Alex comes in. He has JJ in his arms JJ appears to be asleep with his head on Alex's shoulder. Now, in his initial preliminary hearing testimony, he testified that JJ was wearing pajamas. Mm-hmm. That's my recollection. This time he couldn't remember. He said, well, he might have had on shorts. He might have had on camouflage clothes. He wasn't sure. But Alex brought him in. JJ was asleep on his shoulder and Alex took him upstairs. Now, we don't know whether JJ was asleep or whether he was drugged or whether he was even alive at that point. We don't know. So, but we know that by 10 o'clock the next day, Alex is in Chad Daybell's backyard and they're digging JJ's grave. So we know that sometime in that night, over that night, JJ is killed. So the autopsy report, the medical examiner says that they believe that JJ died by suffocation, by a plastic bag being put over his head. And we can get onto that in a minute. But so there's really no way to know whether David Warwick really had a nightmare, whether he heard something in his sleep that triggered a nightmare, whether he just had a kind of vibe that something weird was going on. We don't really know. What he says happened is he had a terrible nightmare. Melanie woke him up because he was having this terrible nightmare. And she was so freaked out about it. She went to get Lori, hoping that Lori could help her calm David down, and perhaps that she could get Chad to give him a blessing. Now, presumably, Tammy was still alive, so presumably Chad wasn't there with Lori, but perhaps get him on the phone and he could give David a blessing and sort of calm him down. David said during his testimony that it was a very dark, really violent dream, and they, I'm sure, would have interpreted that as Satan threatening him in some way. So it made sense that they were looking to have somebody give him a blessing at that point.
Mm-hmm. Keep going.
I just don't know. I mean, people speculate that maybe he's telling that story to cover up JJ's death, or that he heard something. I don't really know. He doesn't really strike me. He's kind of a simplistic kind of a guy in a lot of ways. I mean, he doesn't strike me as being the kind of person who would really go out of their way to make something up like that. He seems like a simple guy.
Okay, that's interesting. I wondered what your perspective would be. So we got some interesting questions. I want to talk about one and get your thoughts on the other about some of the differences. There was a huge difference between the way Tylee was buried and the way JJ was buried. There was a huge difference in the way Tylee's body was treated. It was burned and just kind of in pieces. And the way JJ's was treated, it was buried all intact as a single body. You know, it was not burned, bound with duct tape in plastic bags. Tylee's was buried very deep. His was not very deep, 6 feet, I think was the statement. And JJ's not at all, although it was sort of ritualistic between the white rocks on top and the boards on top. So it was not in any way something where he was just hastily thrown into a shallowly dug grave. There was attention to it. But that is strange, the differences in that. I mean, I want to speculate, and I'm really curious to have you do the same. I feel like Lori had a very different view of Tylee and of JJ. That Lori and Tylee had the contentious arrangement that is often the case between a mom and a teenage daughter. You know, they are often at loggerheads and they're mad at each other and they're always fighting. And I think very much it sounds like Tylee and Lori had a lot of disagreements and were angry a lot, and less so with JJ. To me, that seems like maybe Lori was involved in some, direct way with the burials of the two. I'm curious, what do you think about the extreme difference between the way the two bodies were treated?
Well, it's always been a question for a lot of folks. And I have to agree that there is such I'm sorry, I'm going to sneeze. Oh, it's allergy season. There is an extreme difference between the two burials. It appears that Tylee was killed someplace else, and that her body was brought to the Daybell property, probably already, excuse me, dismembered. I think that it's interesting that one of the things that Zulema testified about was that Chad had told them that when you cast an evil spirit out of a body, you have 2 minutes before
that really bothered me.
Some other more powerful spirit will move in. And so it's important to destroy the body by burning it or dismembering it. So that's a little bit of a clue of where they thought Tylee was at. I agree that she and Lori had a contentious relationship. I think they loved each other, but I think that they had a sort of typical teenager mom relationship, and that it was sometimes difficult. We've heard a lot about the fact that Tylee was very angry at her mother for getting involved with Chad Daybell right after Charles Vallow had died. I don't believe that. I think she had a similar relationship with Charles Vallow. I think sometimes she liked him and sometimes she didn't like him at all. And we've also heard that she was very headstrong. She was very blunt. She was very kind of sarcastic, and you never really had to guess what Tylee was thinking because she would tell you. So, I mean, I think you put all those things together, and I think there's a variety of things going on because, first of all, this is their first body disposal. So they're kind of learning as they go. Now, Chad Daybell was a cemetery sexton, but that is a very sterile, very hands-off kind of a process. It is not the kind of process that happened for Tylee. So I think they brought her body parts there. They were convinced that if they soaked them in gasoline, they could burn them in the fire pit. That didn't work. There were certainly, it wasn't as successful as they wanted it to be. And they had time constraints because Tammy Daybell was still alive and she was coming home from work. So I think at that point they panicked. They piled everything in that green bucket and they buried it, thinking that they might try and come back and do something with it later. And just to get it out of the way. And that's when Chad sent the infamous raccoon text explaining to Tammy that there had been this activity in the backyard, that there'd been digging and there'd been a fire and things that were out of the ordinary. So I do think that by the time they got to JJ, they had thought it through a little more. It seems to me that Tylee's death was a little bit more spur of the moment than JJ's. I think JJ's was a little more planned. And at that point, I think that there were a lot of indications from JJ's burial place that it was more thought out. Although it was a remarkably shallow grave, he was
yes, it was
wrapped very tightly. One of the things that I noticed in the photographs that were shown of his burial is the first thing you see is this circular object in black plastic sticking out of the dirt. And the first thing I noticed was how tightly wrapped that black plastic was around that round object, which turned out to be JJ's head. And when they sliced through that black plastic and peeled it back and revealed the white plastic bag was over his head, it was also very tightly wrapped around him. It wasn't loose in any way. It was almost, you could almost see his features. If they had not put duct tape across his nose and mouth, you would have been able to see the outline of his facial features. So very tightly wrapped. And he was very tightly wrapped in black plastic. I think that was an effort in part to discourage predators. And I think that was the same reason for putting down the wood and the rocks. I'm not sure it was particularly ceremonial. I think it was just practical. That the more they did to protect the grave, the less potential was some predator was going to dig it up.
I can see that with the boards. To me, the rocks seem a little more precise and intentional, the white rocks. But let me ask you about this, and I don't even have a speculation on this. Some people asked about it. I don't know. What was that hacking at Tylee's pelvis about? Because the testimony from two different witnesses was this was not about dismemberment. So what was that?
Well,
was that just stirring the fire?
Two things, I think. I think that was part of it. I think part of it was just stirring the fire and trying to get the remains into the fire. I think the other thing was that these were not necessarily folks that were well versed in how to cut up a body or a deer, or, you know, I mean, I don't know that any of them were particularly hunters that were used to disarticulating game or any of those things. So I think it was clumsy. But I also think that in that regard, if you think about it, that probably was, I hate to be so graphic, but that probably was the largest portion of her body. And they probably were trying to get it in the fire and break it up so that it would burn faster. I mean, that was my theory from the beginning.
Right. I want to talk also about the sufficiency of the evidence. I got a ton of questions on this from Lauren B. and Rockin' Dockin, South Carolina, and I Love Elvis, Not Priscilla. There were so many people who wanted to know about, has the prosecution met its burden of proof? What's the evidence that the state believes proves its case? And what happens if they connect Chad and Alex, but not Lori, to the murders? And I want to talk about some of those things from the perspective of the timeline, which which y'all can go look at in my prior videos or also on my Twitter, LawyerlyW. But they've done a lot of things to pull Lori into the web with things like text messages that were sent right around the times of the murders, and with where she was or her reaction, for example, when Alex apparently missed when he shot at Tammy Daybell. There was testimony on the exact day and showing where she was and that she was with other people at the time. And so their memory of what she said would relate to Alex having missed when he shot Tammy. So they've done things like that. What do you think about whether they're meeting their burden of proof thus far? What's your thought on that?
Well, I think that is the biggest question as we look at them starting to wrap up. I think the biggest maybe deficiency or weakness in their case is the Lori connection. So I always describe a circumstantial case as a chain of links, and every link is a fact. And the links have to connect and make a whole chain in order for you to prove that circumstantial case. And I'm not sure that they have linked it up sufficiently. So I agree that the phone call that was overheard having to do with Alex missing Tammy is a really big kind of smoking gun when it comes to the conspiracy to murder Tammy. And I think there are some other things that they're going to be able to link up in their closing arguments having to do with Tammy and her death. I'm less optimistic about the case with Tylee and JJ because I feel like they have not quite made the connection yet. There are lots of text messages, but she was smart enough that she would text somebody and say, "Hey, call me," and they would have a phone call. And there were a lot of telephone calls that, of course, there's no record of. So, I mean, the jury, I think, is going to have to make a bigger leap to look at phone. They did a good job of presenting those windows of opportunity around the deaths of Tylee and JJ. And they did a good job of presenting where everybody was and the text and phone transactions that were going on. So yes, Chad is and Alex are both texting Lori and having phone calls with Lori during the time when they were disposing of the bodies. What does that mean? Is the jury going to assume that they were having conversations about the destruction of the bodies, or is the jury going to say, we can't know what those conversations were about? I think it's a deficiency in the case.
And I don't disagree that that's without question the hardest part for the prosecution is hooking Lori in on that. To me, I think the evidence that shows that she has had knowledge that the children were dead and hid that over and over and in different ways. She would tell some people one thing and other people yet another thing. And I think all of that is going to mount up to convince them she was part of what went on. I think the hair under the tape, I don't want to, we're going to talk about this later, but I think the hair under the tape is going to rope her in, although granted, we do not know that yet. I also want to say quickly, thank you to Neris Kiran. And yes, please hit that like button. It definitely helps to get this video out to more people and to more new people. I would appreciate that. And be sure to subscribe. We're covering the Lori Vallow Daybell trial in detail. And this is one you absolutely do not want to miss. So I want to talk about more generally, because I got several questions about circumstantial evidence and the way that impacts the jury. And one of the things that it does for the jury, the law can say circumstantial evidence is the same as direct evidence all it wants. In reality, circumstantial evidence is not the same as direct evidence. It's just not the same. But if there's enough, most juries will tend to accept it. But I kind of wanted to get you to, from your own criminal experience, tell us a little bit about what you see as far as circumstantial evidence and the way it impacts juries. What have you seen?
Well, I think that it is really important, and this is something that I don't think either side did very well in opening statements. I think that it is the defense's job to say to the jury, we want you to look for the places where there are holes in those links in the chain. So just an explanation that I often gave was to say to someone, imagine that you have a jigsaw puzzle with 500 pieces. Now you take it out of the box and you figure out where all the borders are and you get all the edges together and you start filling it in. Well, you can fill that jigsaw puzzle in and there might still be a piece missing here and a piece missing there. But you can still tell what that image is. You can still tell, oh, that's a flower and that's a dog and that's a balloon. And that is a good circumstantial case that has connected enough of the pieces so that you can see that big picture image. If, on the other hand, you have a corner over here and you look at it and go, I don't know, is that a flower or is that a dog? I can't tell. What should be in that space? That's reasonable doubt. And that's reasonable doubt in a circumstantial case. So I think right now, of course, I can't tell what's in the jurors' minds, but from a spectator's standpoint, I can say there's at least a spot in that jigsaw puzzle where I don't know whether that's a dog or a flower. And I know a lot about the case. So I'm concerned that the jury is going to have a hard time making the leap from Lori Vallow's children are dead to Lori Vallow was directly involved with their death and planned and somebody made a substantial step. It's her direct involvement that is still, I think, not completely proven.
And that brings me exactly to, I think, the next question. Kay Oakley and Marjorie Morse had a very intelligent discussion about what exactly the charges are against her. And I want to read what I think they were. I could not find a superseding indictment that replaced this. So this is what I think they are. And you tell me if it's still This is it. It's a conspiracy to commit first-degree murder and grand theft by deception related to Tylee. That was Alex, Chad, and Lori. And then there was first-degree murder of Tylee. And that was Lori and Chad, not Alex, which was interesting to me. And conspiracy to commit first-degree murder and grand theft by deception of JJ, Alex, Chad, and Lori, and first-degree murder of JJ, Lori, and Chad. And then there was conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. That was of Tammy, and that was, again, Chad, Lori, and Alex. But when it came to first-degree murder of Tammy, that was Chad only. So Lori was only charged with the conspiracy count in connection with Tammy.
Right.
There was grand theft, felony of Tylee and JJ's Social Security benefits, and that was Lori only. And there was insurance fraud, claiming Tammy's insurance from LifeMap Assurance Company. That was Chad only. And insurance fraud on claiming Tammy's insurance from Primerica. And that was Chad only. Is that okay?
That's right.
So, and in that cluster of facts, I think it's important to note where Lori is included and where she isn't included. But she's definitely included on both conspiracy and first degree for Tylee and JJ, and conspiracy for Tammy. And that's truly what the main case is about. Mm-hmm. The grand theft is sort of a lesser included thing. It's certainly true that from what her own admission that she knew that they were dead and she kept collecting insurance. So I think that that's a pretty easy claim for the state, but it's not murder. It's not even close to murder. It's right. Long way from it. So do you know, has there been discussion, is there a possibility of parole if she's convicted of murder in the first degree?
This is an interesting question, and I've been over the statute. I have been told by a couple of Idaho lawyers that the court has the discretion to sentence her to life without parole. Now, my understanding of the statute as it applies to murder is that if the state seeks the death penalty, then it can either be pled down or the jury in the mitigation or in the penalty phase can say, we think there's mitigating circumstances and impose the impose life without parole. But I'm told that the judge can also impose life without parole. So I am not an expert on Idaho sentencing guidelines, and they use undetermined sentences. They're non-determinative sentences. So they don't have a determinative sentencing scheme like a lot of states do. So I have to rely on the experts and what they tell me. I'm sorry, Jessica's not here because she may have been able to,
right. I had that
a lot easier than I
wondered, if you had heard anything about it. And I do want to thank Missy I. Hunt and Jessica, who both were interested in that question. Here's a question for you, because you and I apparently both talked about this on our live streams recently. The tools from Chad's shed that were not sent to the FBI to compare and to correlate with Tylee's remains. And I said, that's funny. That's some good cross there. Why wasn't that sent? I have that same question. It should have been sent. So, and I think we both thought that was an issue where the prosecution definitely should have done that and didn't. Somebody asked, can the prosecution do that now for Chad's trial? I don't see why they could not if it's still feasible, I suppose, depending on whether there's been destruction or disintegration of some of the items. It might be impossible, but are you aware of any reason you could not do that?
I'm not aware of any reason. I think at this point they can continue to do that kind of investigation right up until the trial. I mean, there's DNA that we know that was discovered. The thing about the hair in this case is some of those hairs that were discovered were not tested until very late, and then they are the subject of the late discovery. And I don't know that we're going to see him come in Lori's case.
Interesting. Okay.
They talked about them, but I don't think we're going to see them come in, because
I think that the reason that Chad wanted it, there was a hint that it was exculpatory, that it would get him off. And that's why he had, not get him off, but exculpatory evidence, I just want to explain,
Right.
means it suggests that you're innocent, or that there was something that is in your favor. And so I felt like that meant was more likely to be related to Lori than to be related to Chad, because of the fact that he really wanted to make sure he could address that evidence. And there was even a suggestion that it was something favorable to him. So that's been my guess, is that that's what it was. But really, I mean, they walked right up to it over and over throughout the trial, where they said, you know, the hair right here, and we got this hair, and we were like, well, what whose hair? Whose hair? It's really important. I mean, if that's Lori's, that's huge. I can't believe that, given the fact that she insisted on going forward, and he used the death penalty as his way of dealing with the prosecution's late production. I'm surprised if he would completely eliminate it, but that would be, wow. Okay, we will see.
Yeah, well, it'll be interesting to see when we get to Chad's trial. I suspect that it is either belongs to JJ or belongs to Alex. We got Alex's fingerprints on the bags, and you know, I mean, what is the likelihood that Lori left her hair on that tape? Well, it is not outside the realm of possibility, but I think that it's, you know, more likely that it could belong to the victim, or to Alex, who clearly, we know his fingerprints are there, so we know he was there. But you know, the other thing about duct tape is it's sticky. And so you can have completely unrelated stuff stuck to duct tape. If it's a roll of duct tape that's been laying around the house, you know.
There was good cross on that. The cross was, well, couldn't there have been a hair in the bottom of your bag somewhere? And so you just happened to pull that up. And, well, yeah, that's actually possible. So still, if it came from Lori, then it had to get there into the examiner's bag somehow. So it came from somewhere. Sure. But it could be somebody's clothes, and she did the laundry. I understand that.
Well, and if it's a roll of duct tape that was in Chad's shed, it could belong to anybody in Chad's family.
Right. You know? True.
That's why I said initially that I didn't think that it was particularly relevant or helpful if Chad's DNA showed up on any of those tools, because they were in his tool shed.
Right. So, I agree with that. That really wouldn't have helped, because of course he used all of those.
Right.
Yeah. I want to look at Michael Sinn's questions. He's asked, is the jury allowed to work backwards? Like, they see a bunch of evidence that says, oh, she was just fine, not all that perturbed after they died. Could they think that is her admitting, in other words, that it's the end result of something she wanted to happen, of a successful scheme? And
sure, I mean, it's all consciousness of guilt. It's all an example of her behavior telegraphing her guilt. And certainly those kind of things are absolutely part of a circumstantial case. So, you know, I think we just haven't gotten to she killed her kids because she wanted to live this blissful life, and now they're dead, and now she's living this blissful life. So, I mean, I think we have not quite connected all the dots yet.
Yeah. And thank you, Michael, for your question. Banshee Rose asked a good question. She asked about, will we ever be able to see the notes that Lori has been taking during the trial? Do those become a part of the official trial records at some point? And no, they don't, because those are going to be considered attorney-client privilege, part of her taking notes so she can ask questions of her attorney, so she can share ideas for her own defense. So all of that will remain hers. It will not ever become public. It would be a violation of the attorney-client privilege for the court to release those. But I thought that was a really good question. Laura H wanted to know, and I think I said that was Banshee Rose. Laura H wanted to know, okay, when voice orders evidence, the judge orders evidence to be published to the jury. I thought this was another good question. I mean, the kind of thing you just wouldn't know unless you were there in the courtroom. What are jurors getting? Are they getting hard copies or displays on their screen or something else? And I think that depends on the evidence, but you want to talk about what you've actually witnessed?
Sure. My understanding is they will have a computer terminal in the jury room. So they have been, the prosecutor has been putting into evidence thumb drives. So, and they're all marked as to what they are. In some cases, in the case of the PowerPoint displays that some of the witnesses use to sort of consolidate all the information, they were printed in print form and then provided with the thumb drive so they could use either. In the instance where they're audio clips or like the phone calls, those are on thumb drives that they can play on the computer in the jury room. So it's a variety of ways that they'll be able to use those things in the jury room. But publishing to the jury means showing it to the jury in court on the record. Now, what we've seen so far in the courtroom has been they have an Elmo, so they have one of those projectors that projects whatever it's looking at up on the screen, kind of like an old overhead projector, I guess, a new generation of that. And so when they are showing things in open court, they take the photo or the page and they put it under the projector and it projects up on this big screen in the courtroom. It also projects on other screens around the courtroom, a screen for the defense, a screen for the prosecution, and there are screens in front of the jury. Now, when the judge was showing some of the more graphic photos, they decided they weren't going to display those on the screen because the judge felt like putting those graphic photos up writ large on the wall would be overwhelming and somewhat prejudicial. And so those graphic photos were projected on the screens in the jury box. So the jurors saw those, and then they kind of rearranged the courtroom. They were not shown on the live feed in the live feed area. So the jury will have those. They'll have them on a storage device, and they'll probably also have the printed pictures. So they'll be able to look at them both ways.
And to explain just a little bit to folks who aren't familiar with what it means to publish something, just sort of on a basic level, what will happen is in the courtroom, the lawyers walk around and the lawyer will say, I'm going to use Exhibit 58. And everybody has a list in advance of what Exhibit 58 is, and they can look at that. And it will be shown to the defense counsel. If you're the prosecution, you would show it to the defense counsel. The judge will see it. And not until everybody has had a chance to object, the judge has had a chance to rule it in or out, only then do you want to show it to the jury. Because if you showed it too early, you could end up with a real problem. You could end up with a mistrial or an appeal issue. And so what you want to do is make sure the evidence doesn't go in until everybody's had their chance to make sure this is actually evidence that should be at trial. And so when they talk about publishing it to the jury, they're talking about, okay, now you're allowed to show it. And up until then, it's supposed to be kept just among those people who are going to be objecting or ruling on whether or not it's going to come in. Because it's sort of an odd concept. So I can understand why people would be, what is that about, the publishing?
And different states and different courtrooms handle evidence differently. It's been really interesting to watch. In the Murdoch case, you had the prosecution leaning over, handing Dick Harpootlian a copy and saying, yeah, okay, I've seen that, and them sort of switching documents back and forth. In this case, when the prosecution says, I want to offer this exhibit, they hand it to a uniformed deputy bailiff who holds it against his chest like he's protecting it from the world, takes it over to the prosecution, shows it to them, holds it back against his chest, takes it over to the if it's an exhibit that needs to be discussed on the stand, or they need to talk about foundation questions for it, he takes it over to the witness, and so there's this uniformed officer going around directing traffic with all the exhibits. Now, there are a lot of jurisdictions where the prosecution and the defense both prepare their exhibits in advance. They're put together in a binder along with an exhibit list, and they're passed out to everybody. There's one for the judge and one for each side and one for the witness stand. And then as you go through the exhibits, and you are offering them and deciding what's going to be offered and what's going to be admitted, but everybody already has it, so there's not all that shuffling and passing of exhibits back and forth. So it's been kind of different.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Well, I've got a bunch of questions left, so what I'm going to try to do is have us go through these really fast, because I want to get as many in as we can. We got great questions. I think you'll enjoy thinking about them and answering them. Mr. RN just asked us, is it too late for Lori to cut a deal, and will she? Technically, it's not too late. I mean, technically, you could still cut a deal, but it's not going to happen. I mean, it definitely would already have happened. That's just my read. Your read, Lori?
That's my read as well. Although I do think that there's a 50-50 chance that Chad will cut a deal.
Interesting.
But the prosecution doesn't want to try this case again, and they know it. And so I think they're going to press for they're going to get the death penalty off the table, and they're going to press for some concessions.
I'll just go ahead and throw that question out there. To me, it seems very difficult for the court to find. I realize technically it's possible that Lori could not get the death penalty because it was taken off the table because of the fact that the prosecution did not produce some evidence in a timely manner, and for Chad to get the death penalty. But just in practical terms, it just doesn't seem like that's going to be very easy for the court to accept. Very palatable. What's your thought on that?
No, I agree. And I agree that I think when you're looking at co-defendants and you're looking at literally the same evidence, co-defendants, and one gets the death penalty and one doesn't, I think that definitely raises some due process appellate issues, some equal protection issues.
Right.
Yeah.
I want to talk about the defense case. We got some great questions on that, about what exactly the defense is going to do in its case. Do we know whether the defense has any experts lined up?
As far as we know, not. But the other thing, of course, is this court has sealed an awful lot of stuff, including the witness list. So we've never been able to see the witness list. We literally do not know who's coming until they walk in the door.
Right.
So it's a little hard to tell. If I have speculated that I think they're going to go after, they filed a notice of alibi, which everyone agrees has been almost silly. How do you file a notice of alibi in a conspiracy case? It doesn't make any sense, because you can conspire from anywhere, anytime. But they filed this notice of alibi, and they've said, Lori was in her apartment when the children were killed in Alex's apartment, and she was in Hawaii when Tammy Daybell died. And so she wasn't even in town when it happened. And so I think that's where they're going to go with their testimony, with their defense witnesses. I think they're going to be offering witnesses to say, yes, I was with her at the time that these things happened.
Which is not all that helpful to her.
Not really, but I think that's the only thing they feel they have at this point.
Right. Yeah, I don't see a lot else they have, except I thought perhaps they might have experts, but I guess we don't know that. It just doesn't seem like it.
The only other alternative is to poke holes in the scientific information, and that's a hard pull unless you've got some really obvious mistakes in the way that it's handled. I think it's a hard pull these days to challenge scientific info.
And in truth, it's not really the scientific evidence that's convicting her anyway. If she gets convicted, it's not going to be because they showed some scientific fact about the way Tylee was killed or the way JJ was killed. Instead, it's going to be because of the array of evidence that suggests she was tied into not just this, but other events. I think the admission of the evidence about Brandon Boudreaux and Charles Vallow was of enormous importance in this case because it suggests a pattern that she had, and that's exactly what the prosecution was aiming for. That's what they wanted.
Right. I do think that the one place potentially that they could be looking to question is the cast data. The FBI came in and said, here's how we figured out where these cell phones were. And it was from GPS and from Wi-Fi and from, and I recently read an article about this process, and the FBI does it. And it really amounts to how they apply algorithms to the data. And so where in the past we've had, well, you have 3 cell towers and you can sort of triangulate among them and you can know that this phone was in this general area. Well, the way they manipulate the data, they have been able to say, we can pinpoint a cell phone in a radius of 3 feet, in a radius of 6 feet, and much more precisely. But there's some question about the scientific validity of that analysis process. So that would be the only place I would think that they would be questioning scientific data.
I thought it was inconsistent too, because sometimes they would say, oh, well, we were able to track Alex to the street. And other times we were able to track him to within 1 foot of this exact spot in Chad Daybell's backyard. Wow. Well, that's different. How is that possible?
Some of it had to do with when his phone was connecting to which network. Okay. So when his phone was connecting to the Wi-Fi, the local Wi-Fi, it was not nearly as accurate as it was when he was connecting to the GPS satellite data. So it depends on how he was connecting and I think there is some question about the way that data is interpreted.
And one of the next questions we got about the defense is, will they bring up ineffective assistance of counsel on appeal? And the answer is 100% yes. Oh. That's what you do. Right. That's always what you object on. I mean, I can see several areas here already. They're going to talk about Brandon Boudreaux should not have been introduced. They're going to talk about Charles Vallow. That evidence should have been ruled out. They'll talk about the fact that there was ineffective assistance of counsel, or they'll at least argue that. And I think based on what you're telling me, they will argue that there was a lack of scientific foundation for the cell phone evidence. So I can clearly see that. Do you have any comments about that question about the ineffective assistance?
Well, a lot of people ask about this. There are a couple of misconceptions out there in the lay population. One is about mistrials. People ask very frequently about mistrials and don't really understand how limited it is to get a mistrial. And the other thing people don't always understand is how difficult it really is to prove ineffective assistance of counsel. Because you not only have to prove that your lawyer individually didn't reach the standard of a reasonable lawyer, and then you have to prove that if it had not been for your lawyer's lack of knowledge or experience, the outcome would have been different. I mean, a classic example is Jodi Arias, where there was misconduct on the parts of both of the attorneys. The prosecutor got sanctioned for having a conversation and then getting romantically involved with a journalist who leaked stuff. The defense was was claimed had committed misconduct in releasing client confidences. And so both of them, I mean, I think they both got disbarred, but and it still did not raise to the level of an ineffective assistance of counsel, overturning it on that basis.
Right.
So
I've shown people on the channel before a graph showing the percentage of cases that get reversed on appeal, and it's like none. It just doesn't happen. It's really, really unusual for it to be. I mean, there's anything to be reversed.
There's some pretty famous cases out there from down south, where in the southern part of the U.S., where a lawyer literally slept through his client's trial.
Wow.
And still, they didn't find him ineffective because they said, well, even if he was ineffective, you would have gotten convicted anyway.
Wow. Yeah. That is bad.
Yeah.
But yes. But in any event, I don't think that it will. I think it definitely will be made on appeal. I think it definitely will be a grounds for appeal. I had a bunch of questions about Chad's case, but for time reasons, I think I'm going to save those for another night. We could do this after Lori's trial is over and talk about how all of this is going to affect Chad's case, because there are lots of things to talk about there. Yeah. But I think we're running out of time. I wanted to keep us roughly to an hour for tonight. So I want to do what I'm just going to call the speed round. I want each of us to answer and try to keep it to 30 seconds.
Okay.
So best witness so far. Go.
Summer Shiflett.
Exactly the person I was going to say. Best piece of evidence for the state.
The fact that Lori was on the phone calling Alex an idiot because he missed shooting Tammy Daybell.
That is huge. That is huge. I think I would put Summer Shiflett's phone call to her sister in jail, to Lori in jail. And the reason is I did a whole video on this, which folks can go back and look at, where I talked about the fact that Lori says that she talks about it having been months since she was, since her kids were, she doesn't really say what happened, but since they were gone, and she'd had a chance to recover and to try to move on with her life. Well, her marriage was only 8 weeks after Tylee's death and 6 weeks after JJ. So to me, that put her knowledge of their death at the exact time that they died. It makes it really clear that this was not something where she really believed that Chad had taken the kids and put them in safety in a cave in Idaho somewhere or whatever, you know. There was nothing like that. She thought the kids were gone for good, and she was sure of that at the time that they died. So I thought that was really important. Sorry, that was probably over my 30 seconds. Okay. Best piece of evidence or argument for the defense that you've heard so far?
I actually think it is the fact that they did not connect the tools and the bone defects, because they had the opportunity to send all those tools and have the FBI say, yes, this caused that defect. So yeah, I would say it probably was not doing that analysis.
Right. That's very powerful. I thought it was probably that Lori was in Hawaii when Tammy died, because I think it can be difficult to hook her to the death. Maybe not that she didn't desire it, but to actually hook her to the death or to knowledge that it was going to happen in advance. I think the prosecution's done a great job of showing a pattern and repeated incidents where about the same thing happened to the same person. Mm-hmm. They became possessed, and then they suddenly, died. But I do think that's a decent alibi for them. All right. So I want us both to answer these questions too. Do you have a prediction on when trial will end?
I really thought the prosecution was going to rest today. I was absolutely convinced. They didn't get there. But I still think we're going to get closing, and we're at least going to get the case to the jury by Friday.
Okay.
By next Friday.
Okay. I think the defense is going to be very, very short, maybe
Mhm.
2 days. Do you agree? Yeah.
Yeah, I a day and a half maybe.
Right.
Yeah.
And rebuttal, there won't need to be a lot. They've saved a couple of witnesses, haven't they, where they did not release them because they said they might use them for rebuttal?
Yeah, and they were primarily law enforcement
Right.
witnesses.
Right.
Mhm.
Okay. Okay. We got a lot of questions about what do we think the jury is going to do. And Lori and I have talked about it in advance, and we both feel like it's a little early for us to say anything about that because just kind of a fairness issue. The defense hasn't had a chance to go and mount its case. And we just feel like maybe that needs to be something that happens. I think, though, you have some interesting opinions, Lori, about hooking the other Lori, the not as good Lori, to the trial. Why don't you talk about, I mean, to the crimes? Why don't you talk a little bit about that? Because I thought we talked about it beforehand, and I thought it was real interesting what you had to say.
Well, I do have some concerns about them clearly linking Lori. And I think it's possible that we could see the jury say, we we feel like she committed some of these crimes because we could find links to those, but the others we couldn't concretely say she knew about this, she helped plan it, she so, part of it is they're going to have to go back in the jury and sit down with the jury instructions and parse the language of the statute and decide whether or not there's sufficient evidence to prove that each element. So, and I have some concerns at this point that they have not made enough of a causal link for each and every one of the charges. Now, I think that the conversation between overheard where she's complaining about Alex Cox not ever getting anything right the night he tried to shoot Tammy Daybell is a real smoking gun that she was involved in that conspiracy. So I think that one is sort of the easy one. The others are a little more complicated about being able to prove precisely her level of involvement. I mean, do I think she was involved? Yeah, I do. But I'm not 100% convinced it's been proven yet.
And my view is that I think it's difficult for people to separate out some of those things to make a real precise cut between this exact wording and that exact wording and say, nope, I'm going to cut it here because they didn't quite cross that. I think that's hard. It's not that it's impossible. It's just really technical. And I think juries often make a decision based on everything they're hearing. And
well, it's going to depend
what did they? Yeah, and
it's going to depend a lot on the personalities on the jury. If they get one of those engineering types who's like, okay, we got it, right. A lot of it, there is a lot of uncertainty in who's on the jury.
Yes, I completely agree. So I do think it's one of the things that is most going to impact the jury, or two of the things, are the Brandon Boudreaux and the Charles Vallow evidence. And that's why that will be such an appellate issue, because it matters. I mean, it was fairly far afield. I thought the prosecution did an amazing job of pulling in the Brandon Boudreaux stuff, maybe a little bit less the Charles Vallow, but the Brandon Boudreaux stuff, I was really impressed the way they just followed that Jeep right up. Well done. But that's a hard issue.
Yeah, I think that is definitely going to be an appellate issue. How far is too far in bringing that in? It's one thing to show it as a pattern or a common plan or scheme. It's another to go into get down in the weeds on the details of whether or not Alex gave him CPR. That I don't know. Does that go beyond into a range that's now prejudicial? I think that's going to be a big issue for the jury, for the appellate court. Yeah.
And with Brandon Boudreaux, you don't have to put everything in. You could just say there was a call on this Jeep. The reason we went to her house was we had a call on this Jeep and there was information that it might have been involved in something down in Arizona. So we went to check it out. You don't have to explain that what it was involved in was taking out the rear seat, although then you have both Chad and Lori there, taking out the rear seat and putting it into the storage unit. That was pretty
Right.
powerful. But in any event, so, I mean, it's not an issue here. It doesn't matter if they murdered or even just shot at Brandon Boudreaux. That's something that has to be addressed in another state. It's not
Right.
in this case.
And we know a lot about this case. Anybody who's been following it for a long time knows a lot of the evidence. And so I can stand back and say, I can see how the prosecution narrowed their focus, and there's a lot of stuff they didn't bring in, stuff that I'm sure may come in the Arizona cases.
Right. Well, I have a couple of more questions, so that gives you plenty of time to hit that like button.
Yes, please.
Before we finish up. I want to know what you think. I got this question from Deb, and that last one came from EJ Condon and some other people. But Deb and many others want to know, do you think Lori Vallow will take the stand?
I still don't think she will. Now, this is funny because I have a follower on my channel who said, oh no, she's so self-absorbed and narcissistic that she will get on the stand because she figures nobody can tell the story better, sort of like Alec Murdaugh. I think she will not. I think she'll follow the advice of her lawyers and not take the stand. But it'll be really interesting to see because I got a pound of Starbucks coffee bet on it. So
okay, all right. And I was unsure. Maybe when we got at the outset of the trial, I thought maybe. After I listened to the phone call between Summer and Lori, I think it is now impossible for her to get on the stand. I thought that was absolutely devastating for her. It's a foreshadowing of exactly what would happen if she got on the stand in front of the jury. It would not go well. I think her lawyers will be able to convince her bad idea. So that's now my thought of that.
I think so. And I think that when you take her call with Colby and her call with Summer,
right,
and put those two together, where she's telling people who are close to her, you don't understand, someday you'll understand. I thought one of the most telling things is the very first statement on the recording with Colby. He says, you murdered my siblings. And she says, I didn't. And there's a real emphasis on the word I didn't. I'm sorry you think you feel that way. But it's very clear that she's saying, wasn't me, you know.
right.
So there are some nuances in those calls that I think are going to be important.
Right. So we got a question from Sorceress2356 wanting to know, okay, who do you think pulled the strings? Who was the puppet master? Tammy from Canada had a similar question about, is it Chad brainwashing Lori? Is Chad in control of Lori? Are they both involved? And I'm going to go with, yes, I do think Chad had more power in that relationship, but I think they were both heavily involved in the decision making. But what's your thought on that?
I have always said this is a perfect storm. Lori had already begun looking into these different kinds of belief systems, the spin-offs from the LDS Church, the multiple mortal probations, and some of the other beliefs going on, the real apocalyptic stuff. She'd already started going there, and that came out in testimony before she met Chad. Now, she probably had been reading his books, but it wasn't until they met in October of 2018 that really the perfect storm happened. So I think she egged him on, and I think she made him feel really important. But there's no question that he decided he was a prophet, and that he was privy to information nobody else had, and he was looking for the power that would come from that. So yeah, I mean, I think she was extremely vulnerable in many ways.
Well, I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. We are following the Lori Vallow Daybell trial, so you want to subscribe, you definitely want to come back. We're going to be covering it all next week. It may end next week. That's what Lori Hellis thinks.
Hope so.
And Lori, I want to thank you so much for being on the channel tonight. And I've got all of Lori's social media linked. I've got her YouTube channel linked. I've got everything. And you can even see where you can order her book soon as she's finished it, as soon as the end of the story is available, right?
Right.
So thank you so much for being there. And we will, I'll be back next week at 7 o'clock on Monday, and I will see you all soon.
Thank you, Lee. Thanks for having me.